I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for her incredible speech, really outlining how since the 1970s, successive Liberal governments have worked very hard to dismantle a national identity in Canada and the obvious detriment that has caused in society. My question to her is in regards to what's happening in citizenships through the courts with those who are not yet citizens in Canada but are seeking to become citizens and break the law. I think we're seeing concerning things that have been happening after 10 years of influence on our court system, and that they are making excuses and having lighter sentences for people who are breaking Canadian law in order for them to become Canadian citizens. Can she comment on that?
Yeah, member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Parliament is supreme. We have the right to make laws in this place. That's what parliamentarians need to re-embrace after a decade of Liberal government acquiescing to the courts in nonsensical rulings like the ones that they should have appealed in this bill that was precipitated this bill, but also the Supreme Court ruling that said that there should be no mandatory minimum sentences for child pornography. Across political stripe, we had Premier Wab Kinew of the NDP in Manitoba say that this was a ridiculous ruling, all the way to the UCP Premier in Alberta saying that this ruling needed to be appealed. Part of Canada's national identity and protecting it has to be, and protecting our pluralism, has to be protecting Canada's democratic institutions, which includes the supremacy of Parliament. It includes us challenging court rulings. We have to get back to our roots in so many different ways in order to restore those ties that bind us together as Canadians, that allow a pluralism to flourish. And if we don't do that, the collapse of this country is inevitable.
Questions and comments?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not entirely in agreement with my colleague, but regarding what she said about national identity, I do agree with what she said, but of course from a different perspective. In Quebec, the question of collective identity is fundamental. And secularism is part of that notion of Quebec identity. How can you integrate immigrants if you don't have a collective identity? It's impossible. And that's the challenge that Quebec has taken up, the question of integration. That is why we are trying to set guidelines on immigration to ensure that immigrants are integrated in French and respect Quebec values, including gender equality and secularism. But admittedly, in Canada as a whole, it's harder to look at things that way. So I'd like to hear from my colleague about integrating immigrants and about the identity she says doesn't exist.
I agree with my colleague that Canada needs to have a strong national identity that is clearly defined and supported in shared symbols, in a government rejecting post-nationalism, which this government has to do. And I want to talk about language, because what the government did was they actually gutted a language requirement amendment from this bill, which the Bloc and the Conservatives worked on together. Mr. Speaker, briefly, my maiden name is Godin. I'm speaking English in the House of Commons because of laws in Manitoba that prevented my family from being able to learn the language in which my family history was robbed from me. Part of my identity was robbed from me. And now we have a government who's rejecting that new citizens should have to learn one of Canada's official languages. It further erodes Canada's national identity. It further erodes the fact that we have two official languages in this country. And again, it's eroding that principle of national identity, which Canadians need in order for newcomers to integrate into our shared social and economic.
Jefford.
Questions and comments?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for Calgary Nose Hill for her speech. And in fact, we traveled together as part of the Interparliamentary Union, and we tried to explain who we are at committee. Well, my colleague touched on the matter of language in her speech, but what is the impact of having rejected the amendments that the Bloc Québécois and Conservatives brought forward at committee, especially on the issue of language? And why were these amendments rejected in this bill?
The honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
There's the practical aspects of the rejection of the language amendment, and then there's the more macro level impact. Practically, by rejecting the language requirement, somebody could be an adult, gain citizenship through descent and not be able to speak one of Canada's official languages. And my colleagues opposite are mocking that. And to me, that goes to the macro level narrative, which is the Liberals do not believe there is a national identity, and they don't believe in the importance of language rights. By rejecting this amendment, they are sending a signal that it's okay to gain citizenship by descent as an adult without being able to speak one of Canada's official languages. How can we be unified as a nation if we can't speak, if there isn't a requirement to speak one of Canada's 2 official languages? How can we continue to respect Canada's how we operate if that's not in place? You know, my colleague, she mentioned we've traveled together with the Interparliamentary Union before, and traveling with her has given me a lot of insight into why French language rights are so important in Quebec. She helped me rediscover my family history too, and how language rights have impacted me. And I have to say that by rejecting this amendment, the Liberals have sent a strong signal that they don't give a rip about language rights, and that they don't believe that language is an integral part of Canadian national identity or the responsibilities of Canadian citizens.